Welcome back to Top Up. We're now looking at renewing the sectional struggle. And we're going to talk today about how the United States is breaking up into different sections, and people have different ideas based on which part of the country they live in. So maybe the people in the North have one view of slavery, which you know we are talking about, and the people in the South have a different view of slavery. So let's look at this first map on this first slide of what the United States looks like in 1850. And so that just gives you a little bit of a kind of an idea about where, what states exist in the United States at this point, and what territories, if we're looking at the orange part of the map on what would you be looking at, this would be on the left side or the west. You see that except for California, these are just territories at this stage in history. And in 1850, when this map is representing, Millard Fillmore on the next slide is our president. Now, Fillmore is from New York. He's the 13th president. His political party is Whig. He's in office from 1850 to 53. And his Secretary of State is Charles Conrad. He doesn't have a vice president. And he's anti-slave, except when he was vice president, his president was pro-slave. Now, Franklin Pierce is the next president. And Franklin Pierce is a Democrat, and he's in office from 1853 to 1857. And of course, the big issue with Franklin Pierce and with Fillmore is slavery. Now, Pierce is opposed to slavery, but he does feel that it's the state's decision to decide whether or not slaves should exist in each state. And so even though people in the North were against slavery, including Franklin Pierce decided to, let's not do anything about this issue of slavery. We'll just let each state take care of its own slave issue. So looking at the next slide, we see the map says 1853. Now, what I want you to notice here on this map is that we're going to see another map and another slide, and what I want you to do is kind of go back and forth between these two maps. 1853, we see Texas right there in the middle with a little pink line right across the top. That becomes part of what is now Oklahoma. And the unorganized territory. Now, the unorganized territory, unorganized just means it's not yet a state. It's not yet a place where there's any kind of government, essentially. People can just go there and there's no law, no state law, that is. Of course, federal law would apply. Now look at the next slide, 1854, and now we see the unorganized territory has split. It's now the Nebraska territory and the Kansas territory. And you can also see a couple of other things, that we now have Indian territory, so that's in the bottom part of what was the unorganized territory. And we also have a little strip down on the bottom that's gray, and by 1854 this is now part of New Mexico territory. So other than this, there's not a whole lot of change to the United States. So we have this one main territory that's now broken into three parts. So if we look at the next slide, and I want you to, as you look at this next slide, think about the last slide we looked at. In fact, you can even pause the video and go back and look at that slide if you like, or you can just look online and find a picture of that slide. So looking at that slide, that map of 1854, we see Kansas and Nebraska. Now, what we know about Kansas and Nebraska is that Kansas is south, and maybe cotton can grow in Kansas, and Nebraska's in the north, and northern territories are not good for growing cotton. And so the big question is, as Kansas and Nebraska become a territory, the big question is, do we allow slavery in Kansas and Nebraska? And so in this next slide, it talks about whether or not slavery will be allowed. And so here are some of the advantages and disadvantages. In January of 1854, farmers wanted to organize this territory, the Kansas-Nebraska territory. And railroaders, people that wanted to build railroads, saw an opportunity to connect the east and the western parts of the country together. Now, the North had more people than the South, and the North argued that because there's more people in the North, then we should have the railroad to serve those people. The South argued, well, because there's not as many people in the South, we need to develop the South more, so the railroad should be in the South. Now, this is called the Transcontinental Railroad. Stephen Douglas is a congressman from the state of Illinois, and he is one of the chief, what we call the chief architects of the Compromise of 1850. And that is what allows Kansas and Nebraska into the United States as separate territories. Now, if we look at, and we're going to talk more about that in this part and in part 2 in the next video lesson. So it's important to understand, looking at the next slide, it says national parties. It's important to understand that the United States at this time was moving from a country where they disagreed on political issues in addition to slavery. By 1850, 51, 52, slavery was the only political issue that mattered anymore. Prior to that, there were lots of other issues. The Whig Party, for example, began because they believed that President Andrew Jackson had too much power. And so they created a party to push back against so much power. And Andrew Jackson created the Democrat Party. The Democrat Party is still around today. The Whig Party is not. Look at the next slide. Whigs disintegrate over the slavery issue because there's Whigs in the North and there's Whigs in the South. And if Whigs in the North are against slavery and Whigs in the South are for slavery, then the party will fall completely apart. And that's exactly what happened. They couldn't agree whether they should be for slavery or against slavery. So in 1856, we have two parties. The Whig Party has disappeared. And out of the Whig Party comes the Republican Party. People in the North that were Whigs become Republicans. People in the South that were Whigs become Democrats. James Buchanan is elected president in 1856. And James Buchanan he's what's called a doughface. President Lincoln calls him a doughface. Now, if you think about dough, if you think about making jiaozi, you can think about squishing that dough in your fingers, and you can see that dough, you can make that dough any shape you want to make it. And that's what President Lincoln later said about President Buchanan, that he is a doughface, even though he's from the North and he's against slavery. The Southerners could make him look like anything he wanted to look like. So he would change his views. That's the idea. And so the whole idea of sectionalism, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act we'll talk more about in the next lesson, but it's very much a part of sectionalism. And it's really important that you understand not only this word as a vocabulary word, but also the idea and the concept of sectionalism, because we've broken into sections in the country and how we view. In Chinese, you might say a department or a region, like Nanbu or Beibu, the northern or southern departments. But in this case, they're based on their thinking has become northern or southern. And so this issue of slavery is the one issue that really determines what their political views are. And so by 1856, people in the North are mostly opposed to slavery, and that's how they vote for president. And people in the South are mostly in favor of slavery, and that's how they vote for president. Before 1856, it wasn't that way. It was slowly becoming that way, but it wasn't really that way. We weren't really a sectional country until about 1850 to 1856. So, all right, so we'll see you guys in part 2 in the next lesson. Until then, we'll see you later. Bye-bye.